I'm fighting like hell, and we're going to protect Canada. He's underestimating the Canadian people, the resilience of the Canadian people, and the strength of the Canadian people. I don't start a tariff war, but we're going to win this tariff war.
Ontario just told the United States to back off with a massive $20 billion deal that cuts America out completely. The huge Volkswagen battery factory being built in St. Thomas right now isn't just another business deal. It's Ontario taking its economic future into its own hands and turning away from the US for good. This gigafactory will make batteries for 1 million European cars every year, and not a single one will be sold to Americans. Ontario is taking its valuable resources, skilled workers, and perfect location directly to European partners who appreciate what they're getting. But can the US afford to lose Ontario's critical resources to European competitors? Will this even work in the first place? Can a single province really defy the world's largest economy and get away with it? And if Ontario succeeds in this bold move away from US dependence, how quickly will other provinces follow suit? Keep watching to see who comes on top when 50 became the new 25. In Windsor, a retired utility worker sat stunned as President Donald Trump announced new tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, doubling the rate from 25% to 50%. The infrastructure that once symbolized cooperation was now being used as leverage in a mounting trade dispute. Industrial leaders across Ontario immediately began recalculating their positions. At the Sault Ste. Marie steel plant, calls came in from European clients. Hamilton steel mills explored shipping through Atlantic ports. The tariff hike was not a minor adjustment. It demanded a full reevaluation of market priorities. The automotive sector suffered instantly. Parts from Ontario failed to reach key factories in the United States. Production lines in Kentucky, Texas, and Michigan were halted. The just-in-time supply chain model collapsed, costing an estimated $10 million per hour. In St. Thomas, executive Sebastian Wolf stood on a site soon to house Volkswagen's most significant North American project. Initially planned for logistical efficiency, the battery gigafactory was now an act of economic independence. Ontario was pivoting away from Detroit and toward Düsseldorf. The province's raw materials, clean energy, and evolving trade priorities made it an increasingly attractive partner for Europe. What began as retaliation had become redirection. The gigafactory gamble. In St. Thomas, a factory rose that would alter the balance of industrial power. 370 acres were being developed to host a Volkswagen battery facility, capable of supporting up to 1 million electric vehicles annually. 3,000 direct jobs would grow into tens of thousands through supply chains. The solid-state battery technology was a breakthrough. It promised greater range and lower costs, addressing the key barriers to electric vehicle adoption. Local officials hailed it as a rebirth for the city, an economic future rooted in energy innovation. Training centers coordinated with provincial colleges to reskill laid-off auto workers. Among them was Maria Santos, who once assembled conventional auto parts, but was now preparing for a new career in clean energy. Strategically, Ontario's advantage extended far beyond its borders. Its access to lithium, nickel, and cobalt positioned it as a global resource hub. Memoranda signed with the European Union ensured streamlined permitting and long-term access. When Ontario redirected rare earth shipments to Europe during the power dispute, it sent a clear message. The province was no longer tied to Washington's agenda. New deals were inked specifically to bypass American intermediaries. The plant was powered by Ontario's nuclear and hydroelectric grid. Reliability, transparency, and strategic neutrality had become more valuable than proximity. The trust that snapped. In Toronto, grid operator Leila Fakhri was given a directive that once seemed inconceivable. Simulate what would happen if Ontario cut its power exports entirely. Her model showed immediate instability. Reserves drained, surpluses wasted, and key stations overloaded. The grid had been designed for cooperation, not isolation. On the American side, utilities were just as vulnerable. Upstate New York, rural Michigan, and much of Minnesota would face rolling blackouts within days. The networks were technically robust, but politically brittle. In Chicago, a utility executive canceled talks with Ontario Hydro, stating publicly, "We need partners, not leverage." The words echoed through provincial boardrooms. Investment agencies issued memos, warning of capital flight due to perceived volatility. While no physical blackouts occurred, psychological damage spread. 49.4 terawatt-hours of electricity had crossed into the United States from Ontario in 2023, serving millions of homes and businesses. Now every agreement was being reevaluated. 86 high-voltage lines had taken more than 100 years to build. They were monuments to cooperation. Now they stood as symbols of disrupted trust. The short-lived surcharge revealed a dangerous truth. The political weaponization of essential services had become a reality. The confidence that held the system together had fractured. Rebuilding would require more than new rules. It would demand mutual restraint, long-term proof of stability, and the political will to prioritize partnership over power. The question now was not whether the alliance had broken, but whether it could ever be made whole again. The European courtship. In a single day, Canada signaled a dramatic shift. Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped off a government jet at Charles de Gaulle Airport, choosing Paris over Washington for his first official visit. The message was clear. The era of automatic American alignment was ending. At the Élysée Palace, Carney stood beside President Emmanuel Macron and announced a sweeping review of every procurement deal and strategic partnership tied to the United States. No Canadian leader had ever questioned cross-border integration so publicly. Simultaneously in Brussels, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly was in closed-door negotiations. For the first time, Canada was considering involvement in the European Union's $1.25 trillion Canadian dollar Rearm Europe initiative. Joly told reporters afterward, "We've become too dependent on American defense systems. It threatens our sovereignty." The Rearm Plan was Europe's response to growing uncertainty about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Faced with recurring threats from President Donald Trump to withdraw, European nations had concluded they could no longer depend on American military guarantees. The fund aimed to build indigenous defense capacity, from Arctic subs to fighter jets, over 5 years. This shift redefined Canada's global role. Since 1949, Canadian defense doctrine had followed American standards. Now a new path through Europe was being explored. President Macron reassured skeptics in Paris, promising that expansion of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement would strengthen economic and defense ties alike. Since 2017, trade between Canada and the European Union had grown by 66%. With the July 1st deadline for a formal agreement, negotiators raced ahead. In Quebec City, Premier François Legault saw the move as an opportunity. Long culturally tied to Europe, Quebec was positioned to lead in this new alignment. Defense firms were already adapting. Rheinmetall's Kitchener plant was assessed for Arctic vehicle production. General Dynamics in London explored supply contracts with European buyers. The defense realignment wasn't theoretical. It had already begun. Across industries, Canada was demonstrating something new: strategic alternatives that didn't run through Washington. That signal was being received. Look, we connected the dots between cobalt exports, EU climate policy, and indigenous energy sovereignty. You're now ahead of every mainstream outlet still catching up. If that kind of depth matters to you, hit like and subscribe. The defense diversification. In Ottawa, Defense Minister Bill Blair reviewed what had once seemed a foregone conclusion: a $19 billion contract for 88 F-35 fighter jets. With American politics growing unpredictable, even this marquee deal was no longer guaranteed. The issue wasn't just cost, it was sovereignty. American defense contracts came with export restrictions, limited access to software, and political strings. In contrast, Sweden's Saab offered local Gripen production with full tech transfer. France's Dassault promised Rafale assembly and joint development. Britain's BAE Systems proposed building Typhoons on Canadian soil. In London, Ontario, General Dynamics was already adapting. Its plant, long a supplier to American forces, was shifting toward European orders that offered longer contracts and fewer conditions. Rheinmetall's operations in Kitchener were evolving into hubs for Arctic technology. European partners were funding submarine development that directly aligned with Canadian sovereignty concerns. European Union financial support came through programs like the Safe Loan Window. Canadian firms gained access to low-interest capital while maintaining control of designs and intellectual property. European defense customers emphasized partnership and reliability. Long-term deals enabled Canadian contractors to invest in talent and infrastructure. Technology sharing ensured mutual innovation. This wasn't simply procurement, it was industrial strategy. Through Europe, Canada was accessing research and production capacity while reducing its vulnerability to American political influence. The Arctic played a major role. Countries like Norway and Denmark understood the importance of northern defense in ways Washington often ignored. Joint initiatives were creating cold weather systems tailored to Canadian geography. Canadian forces were building a parallel supply chain, one that functioned with or without American cooperation. The Battery Corridor. Innovation was being hardwired into the map. Near Kingston, Umicore was building a $1.5 billion cathode plant. It connected Ontario's mines to Europe's gigafactories, bypassing the United States entirely. The solid-state battery technology being developed could shift the balance in electric vehicle adoption. European firms were more willing to share breakthroughs, accelerating Canada's role in the transformation. In Quebec, Marie Dubois partnered with Dutch agritech startups. Together, they were building battery systems for vertical farms that would operate off-grid and reshape agriculture in both continents. At the Halifax port, expansion projects were making room for battery shipments headed directly to Europe. Meanwhile, the Trans Mountain Pipeline allowed energy exports to reach Asia without touching American territory. European investment was arriving fast. Norway funded hydrogen projects. Germany financed renewable power plants. Dutch banks backed agriculture innovation. Each investment aligned provincial policy with European strategic planning. This was not random. It was coordinated economic sovereignty. Canadian businesses gained access to European capital, research, and global distribution. In return, Europe gained raw materials, manufacturing expertise, and political stability. The result was an infrastructure map that deliberately avoided American choke points. The Battery Corridor running from Ontario to Hamburg became a physical expression of post-American integration. What began as economic defense was becoming something far more permanent. The Battery Corridor. Innovation was being hardwired into the map. Near Kingston, Umicore was building a $1.5 billion cathode plant. It connected Ontario's mines to Europe's gigafactories, bypassing the United States entirely. The solid-state battery technology being developed could shift the balance in electric vehicle adoption. European firms were more willing to share breakthroughs, accelerating Canada's role in the transformation. In Quebec, Marie Dubois partnered with Dutch agritech startups. Together, they were building battery systems for vertical farms that would operate off-grid and reshape agriculture in both continents. At the Halifax port, expansion projects were making room for battery shipments headed directly to Europe. Meanwhile, the Trans Mountain Pipeline allowed energy exports to reach Asia without touching American territory. European investment was arriving fast. Norway funded hydrogen projects. Germany financed renewable power plants. Dutch banks backed agriculture innovation. Each investment aligned provincial policy with European strategic planning. This was not random. It was coordinated economic sovereignty. Canadian businesses gained access to European capital, research, and global distribution. In return, Europe gained raw materials, manufacturing expertise, and political stability. The result was an infrastructure map that deliberately avoided American choke points. The battery corridor running from Ontario to Hamburg became a physical expression of post-American integration. What began as economic defense was becoming something far more permanent, the grid that cannot be cut. What followed exposed the hard limits of political strategy. Inside Ontario's Pickering nuclear station, operations manager David Chen explained a fact no trade minister could ignore. Nuclear reactors cannot be paused. They operate according to physics, not policy. You can't just shut it down because exports drop, Chen told officials. The plant continued producing power, regardless of where it went. That surplus didn't disappear. It needed to flow somewhere. At the Niagara Hydro Complex, Susan Rodriguez faced the same issue. The falls continued feeding turbines, whether or not American customers were receiving power. Blocking exports meant overloading Ontario's grid or wasting clean energy. Neither option was sustainable. 70 years of infrastructure development had created a tightly integrated power system across the border. Grid stability depended on maintaining balance. Too much electricity caused voltage surges. Too little triggered outages. The mathematics behind energy distribution allowed no room for political gestures. In rural Minnesota, hospital administrator Rebecca Thompson was reviewing plans not meant for this scenario. Emergency generators were intended for storms, not cross-border disputes. If imports failed, hospitals would be left vulnerable. Simulations painted a dire picture. If Ontario cut exports, its own grid would destabilize within 72 hours. The United States would see blackouts in less than a week. Battery systems covered hours, not days. Natural gas could help, but not at the scale needed to replace nuclear or hydro baseloads. Grid operators across both countries reached the same conclusion. Cross-border energy integration wasn't optional. It was structural. Disruptions risked collapse on both sides. Energy independence had always sounded appealing until it clashed with engineering. No matter how strong the political will, the infrastructure had evolved to require cooperation. Every analysis confirmed it. Energy threats couldn't be carried out without damaging the very systems they aimed to control. The American counterstrike. In Ottawa, a phone call from United States Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick delivered a clear threat. Suspend Ontario's electricity surcharge or face broader retaliation. Premier Doug Ford had a decision to make. The brief surcharge had revealed leverage, but it had also exposed risk. Now the United States was moving beyond tariffs. President Donald Trump had floated the idea of Canadian annexation before. Few took it seriously. Now, backed by energy pressure and economic threats, it no longer felt like a joke. In Houston, refinery director Jorge Ramirez examined contingency plans. Canadian crude made up over half of American oil imports, more than 3 million barrels per day. Refineries were calibrated specifically for it. Substitutes required expensive long-term re-engineering. The Trans Mountain pipeline expansion had shifted the landscape. Canadian energy no longer depended entirely on American markets. Asian nations, China, South Korea, Japan, were eager buyers. Alberta's output was tied to more than just gasoline. Plastics, chemicals, and fertilizers all relied on that feedstock. Disruptions would ripple through countless industries. State officials were already reacting. Michigan's governor demanded relief over electricity costs. New York introduced emergency energy quotas. Border states were realizing just how dependent they were. Psychological shock set in. American policymakers saw that Canada had real options and fewer reasons to comply. The message was unmistakable. Economic coercion had unintended consequences when targets found viable alternatives. The climate collision? Massachusetts climate planner Alina Vasquez studied the fallout. Ontario's clean power had been crucial to meeting her state's emissions goals. Now, disrupted imports forced utilities to lean on natural gas. Emissions rose 9% in 2 weeks. Minnesota restarted coal plants. New York tapped emergency diesel generators. Every backup option was dirtier than the hydro and nuclear power they had replaced. Ontario kept generating clean electricity. It just wasn't reaching American markets. The climate cost was being paid in the United States. Massachusetts delayed wind and solar rollouts. Without Ontario's export capacity, reliability suffered. Environmental targets were quietly shelved. The irony grew sharper. Trade wars, supposedly about fairness, were compromising environmental progress on both sides of the border. Some in Congress began calling for climate agreements, independent of trade negotiations. Lobbyists pushed for long-term power deals, immune to political swings. Carbon offset programs reappeared. Utility bills rose as companies compensated for missed climate benchmarks. Consumers paid both financially and environmentally. The damage went beyond emissions. Trust in joint environmental planning was unraveling. Coordination that had taken decades to build was being undone in weeks. Energy policy had never existed in a vacuum. Now it was becoming impossible to pretend otherwise. The fracture between trade and climate cooperation was complete. The silent industrial realignment. There was no press release, no headline. Just change. In Windsor's industrial zone, a once dormant factory buzzed back to life. The production lines were different, the destinations unfamiliar. What was once built for Detroit was now headed to Hamburg. Plant manager Sarah Mitchell walked among assembly workers producing electric vehicle chargers, destined for the Netherlands and Germany. The workers had been retrained under new provincial programs, financed not by Ottawa or Washington, but by Dutch and German investors. Ontario's economic shift was being executed without fanfare. A quiet initiative called the Advanced Manufacturing Innovation Corridor was converting underused land into modular facilities built for flexibility. European customers were not asking for politics. They were asking for certainty. Korean engineers were helping train local teams in battery component manufacturing. Norwegian investors were backing hydrogen plants tailored for Scandinavian grids. Ottawa tech firms were building predictive software to optimize power exports to Europe. Premier Doug Ford appeared at ribbon cuttings with executives from countries few Canadian premiers had partnered with before. But the message was consistent. Economic flexibility would outlast political threats. In Northern Ontario, Indigenous-led microgrids were feeding surplus power into the provincial system. The communities that once endured winter outages were now producing clean energy and employment. No announcement celebrated this transformation. It unfolded contract by contract, quietly altering Ontario's economic orientation. The shift was slow, deliberate, and driven by private confidence in European reliability. American contracts had grown unstable. Political interference made long-term agreements feel uncertain. In contrast, European buyers offered multi-year deals with automatic renewal. The stability unlocked investment in training, equipment, and innovation. Local colleges were partnering with German and Dutch institutions. Curricula were updated to reflect global technology, not just North American systems. The skill sets being developed now belong to a broader industrial map. Ontario's transformation was advancing on a commercial timeline. Diplomacy was no longer the only engine of change. Business was leading. The new Atlanticism? In Singapore, Ontario's Minister of Economic Development signed a cobalt export agreement with a Vietnamese consortium. It barely made the news, yet it signaled a broader trend. Canada's trade strategy was now global by default. The contract bypassed American financial systems entirely. Payments were in euros and yen. Asian and European partners were offering upfront financing and regulatory stability, two things the United States no longer consistently provided. In Saskatchewan, wind power was sold to Nordic buyers via blockchain, avoiding the US dollar. In Alberta, pipeline infrastructure was being expanded toward Pacific and Atlantic terminals, not Midwestern refineries. Strategic coordination had become decentralized. European Union officials coordinated directly with provinces. Dutch banks backed clean agriculture. Norwegian funds supported zero-emission projects. The new Atlanticism wasn't a treaty, it was a pattern. In Toronto, venture capital favored startups that prioritized European markets. Software developers optimized for Brussels codes rather than Washington's. The incentives were changing quietly but definitively. In Quebec, a battery hub was competing with California for innovation, but facing Europe for export. The facility was backed by French and Dutch capital, and designed to support Atlantic shipping, not continental supply. Canadian pension funds were adjusting as well. European holdings increased. American exposure decreased. Hedging strategies changed to reflect a realignment in alliance confidence. It was not isolation, it was rebalancing. The financial architecture was adapting to political unpredictability. The battery wars? In Canadian labs from Halifax to Montreal, research partnerships were forming with European institutions. Solid-state battery technology was advancing, without dependence on American licenses or standards. Quebec's battery hub was attracting global talent. Unlike American centers, it operated free from export restrictions, allowing researchers broader control over their work and outcomes. Agritech investors were funding Ontario farms to build energy-independent systems. These facilities ran on Canadian hydro and used European technology to optimize food production for cities across the Atlantic. In Alberta, engineers were designing pipelines that connected directly to seaports, avoiding American distribution entirely. Infrastructure was being constructed to last 50 years and aligned with global trade, not just U.S. corridors. Ontario was becoming a strategic hinge between European technology and global energy markets. Battery production wasn't just about cars. It was about which countries would control the next industrial chapter. European automotive brands were building research facilities in Ontario. The intellectual property stayed local. The supply chains avoided American ports and policies. The competition was broader than product performance. Political reliability now factored into every decision. Ontario's new role was grounded in research independence, stable financing, and strategic partnerships that stretched across oceans. The trust that cannot be rebuilt. There was no announcement, no formal break. But everyone noticed. At Windsor's transmission hub, Leila Fakhri monitored flows that once fed Michigan factories. Now half of that electricity was rerouted to reserves, to Quebec, or to ports. The message wasn't stated. It was measured in megawatts. At Queen's University, Professor Michael Harrison explained to students how political trust operated. It was never permanent. It only lasted as long as both sides believed it was worth upholding. The official statements remained polite. Behind the scenes, contracts were shifting, assumptions dissolving. In New York, lawmakers drafted bills to reduce reliance on Canadian electricity. Other states followed. Ottawa's think tanks responded with terms like strategic autonomy and post-American sovereignty. On Saskatchewan farms, Dutch agritech firms became primary partners. In Manitoba, Indigenous-led transmission projects connected to export lines that had no American termination point. American executives reported difficulties in renewing supply deals. Canadian firms weren't cutting ties, but they were prioritizing stability. And Washington was no longer providing it. Norwegian pension funds backed Ontario farms. Quebec signed knowledge-sharing agreements with German municipalities. Alberta opened offices in Singapore. This wasn't a rupture. It was a redirection. Canada had built something the United States hadn't expected: options. Through thousands of small moves, Ontario was making a strategic shift impossible to reverse. So where does that leave the United States now? Can it rebuild trust in a partnership that quietly moved on without it? Will Washington adapt or keep losing ground to alliances it can no longer predict or control? Let us know what you think. Are we witnessing a strategic realignment or the start of something even bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.